I think that Fort Hood encompasses all of the circumstances surrounding Fort Hood, encompasses the entire problem of political correctness, self-censorship, and the assault on free speech. First of all, I just found out yesterday that the Justice Department refuses to categorize the Fort Hood attack, which was unequivocally a terrorist attack, an Islamic terrorist attack, refuses to categorize it as a terrorist attack, thereby preventing the Justice Department from applying the Patriot Act to the investigation. As a result, prosecutors are having hard times now getting search warrants processed in different jurisdictions, thereby circumscribing the investigation. This decision by the Holder administration not to designate the Fort Hood attack as a terrorist attack is part and parcel of how Obama administration has treated the Fort Hood attack, when the first comments made by the president were to categorize it as a tragedy. A tragedy is when a car accident occurs. A terrorist attack is when somebody who yells out Allahu Akbar and murders 13 innocent civilians yelling with a machine gun. That's exactly what happened at Fort Hood. It was a terrorist attack, and it could have been averted. One of the reasons it wasn't averted was because of the self-censorship of military officials, fearing that they could be sued if they reported Major Malik Hassan's behavior, his errant behavior, and his comments over the previous decade that infidels should have their throats cut, that the war on terror was a war on Islam, that it was okay for military officials to be killed, U.S. military officials to be killed. All of these comments were known to U.S. officials, and yet none were reported upwards for fear that they could be sued or fear that political correctness would cause them to be called racists. As it was, the head of the Army, George Casey, his first comments were, he wasn't concerned about the 13 dead. He said he was afraid that diversity would become a casualty of the attacks. Diversity, right. Diversity of killers. The fact remains that Fort Hood, the circumstances surrounding Malik Hassan and the fact that he was in contact with a radical Yemeni cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, for 6 months, with the FBI knowing about it, but designating it innocuous by claiming that it was consistent with his research. His research being, is it okay to kill U.S. soldiers? In which al-Awlaki said, of course it is. And the FBI, JTTF saying, designating this conversation and this exchange of emails to being unimportant and not relevant to a larger national security investigation. Then the President appointed John Brennan, the domestic national security advisor for counterterrorism, to be in charge of the investigation. For all of you who don't know this, John Brennan of the NSC was the official in early August who gave a speech in Washington in which he said that jihad means peace and love, and they were never going to use the term radical Islam in describing militant Islamic activities, because militant Islam was a slap in the face to all Muslims. That in fact the only term they were going to use was the term radical or extremist or violent, but they were not going to use the term Islamic, and that jihad meant union of good. So I figured that after the speech they were going to rename the Islamic Jihad terrorist group the Union of Good. He was in charge, he was put in charge of the investigation. At the same time, the President said, I don't want to see congressional investigations. If it weren't for congressional investigations, we would not know 1/10 of the amount of knowledge we have today because of 9/11. Congressional investigations and the Congressional Commission, even though there were major deficiencies on the 9/11 Commission, and I'm one of the chief critics, it still provided a platform for lots of sources to come out of the woodwork and testify about the lack of contacts and connections that should have been made by the intelligence agencies. So for the President to say, I don't want to see congressional investigations, is essentially to say, I don't want to see the connections being made that should have been made in the intelligence world. The fact of the matter is that the Fort Hood attacks represent an incident when you see them played up in the media. The Washington Post's first headline was, "Anti-war radical targets military." Anti-war radical, right. The attack by Hassan against the U.S. military was the 9th plot against the U.S. military by jihadists this year. The 9th plot. They were not